The Crimean War is of peculiar interest, I think, to English people. It was the only European war that Great Britain took part in the 19th century, between the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 and the Battle of Mons in 1914. It was also, incidentally, the first war that left behind it memorials to the ordinary soldiers who were killed and not merely the generals who led them. Perhaps an indication that it was, in a sense, a popular war, that certainly public opinion in England and to a lesser extent in France had a great deal to do with it. Governments were pushed into war as much as they led into war. The actual beginning of the war, the beginning of the conflict, was a rivalry between two sets of monks in Jerusalem over the keys to the holy Christian places. France backed the Latin monks and Russia backed the Greek monks. Well, as it was the Turkish government that had to allot the keys, both France and Russia put pressure on Turkey. France sent a battleship through the Straits to Constantinople, and the Latin monks got the keys. Then Russia sent an army to the frontier of Turkey, and the Latin monks lost the keys, or some of them. The tension was mounting, each of them putting on the pressure, and each country beginning to suspect the other. By this time, it was commonly accepted in England and France by the governments and by many people too that Russia, this tyrannical power, was hoping to overthrow Turkey and to establish control of Constantinople. Whereas on the other side, the Russians were quite convinced that England and France were hoping to close the straits, make it impossible for Russian trade or Russian ships to get out into the Mediterranean. A competition of suspicion, both lots of suspicion, mostly unfounded, though there's always a tiny element, of course, of justification as well. And then the European powers, behaving sensibly, tried to settle it, and they had a conference at Constantinople, all the five powers, the three involved, England, France, Russia, and Austria and Prussia as well. And they reached an agreement, something which would satisfy the Russians, a legitimate Russian protectorate over the Greek Church without interfering with the sovereignty of Turkey. But something went wrong, and it's been well said that the Crimean War was caused by the fact that there was a telegraph line from most places to Vienna, but no telegraph line from Constantinople to Vienna, because the five great powers all agreed, that's it, we've done it. But they couldn't ask the permission of Turkey because they couldn't get to Turkey in time over the wires. It took something like a week or 10 days to get a message. When the Turks saw this, they said, won't do at all. This deprives us too much of our sovereignty. It took another 10 days for the message to come back. By this time, Russia felt thoroughly cheated. The Russians had agreed to what the other powers of Europe insisted on, and now they were told they couldn't have it. They therefore moved an army, a stronger army, up to and even across the Turkish frontier. Then something quite extraordinary. Turkey, the weak power, the power that was supposed to be on the brink of dissolution, declared war on Russia and moved the Turkish army up against Russia, although there was no fighting. Well, the war had, in a sense, started. It had started without any serious consideration of what was at stake. It started certainly with the Russians having not the slightest idea that they were going to get involved in war over the Russian protection or Russian sympathy with the Greek Church throughout Turkey. It had been started to some extent quite deliberately by Turkey, because the Turks thought the more we can get the war going, the more England and France will get involved. And then a further stage, the Turkish fleet in the Black Sea was a very creaky old fleet, quite unfit for action. There was war. The Russians came out from their naval base in Sevastopol, and they sunk the entire Turkish fleet at a place called Sinope, more or less on what is now the Romanian coast. And here was another extraordinary episode which led to war and produced a tremendous outburst of public opinion, particularly in England. This perfectly legitimate Russian action of war against a country which declared war on it was described as the massacre of Sinope. There were protest meetings all over England, demands for war, and at the same time there were some, though lesser. I don't think the French people counted to the same extent in the actual emotions in regard to Turkey, because here was something new in a sense in European history, a deep involvement of what was called public opinion, what we call public opinion. Perhaps it didn't go so deep down into the population, but it certainly existed. The Crimean War, indeed, I think, was the first war which was helped on by the newspapers. In earlier wars, the newspapers had to catch up afterwards. The Times, in particular, led public opinion. And public opinion was led to believe that Russia was not merely seeking to encroach on Turkey or to destroy Turkey, but was seeking to be the tyrant of Europe. You must remember that only 5 years before, the Crimean War was 1854, only 5 years before, in 1849, Russian troops had intervened to suppress the liberal national revolution in Hungary. And indeed, Russian troops also held down Poland and also sustained the two reactionary powers, Prussia and Austria. Russia prided herself on sustaining what was called the Holy Alliance of reaction. And in England, which was then in its liberal phase, it was widely believed that if Russian power could be destroyed, then Europe would become free. Curious how these things repeat themselves, but certainly this was the theme of the 30s. And the Crimean War was supposed to be a war of liberation. The other powerful factor making for war was the ruler of France, Napoleon III, who'd become emperor in 1852, and, though with little justification, hoped to repeat the successes of his uncle Napoleon I, perhaps not by means of universal war, but by establishing a great political influence. Certainly he wanted to break the idea that France had ceased to be a great power. So here were the two quite different factors pushing to war. In England, the desire to see a great movement for liberation, spontaneous movement of liberation. And in Napoleon, of course, a desire to see a movement maybe of European liberation, but one led entirely by himself. The force, the organization, I was going to say, which was most unwilling to go to war was actually the British government, or certainly some sections of it. The Prime Minister, indeed, Aberdeen, was so determined to remain at peace that he refused to take any precautions, and when, in fact, he had to lead the country into war, he believed he had committed a great sin, and later in life, after he'd retired, refused to build a church on his estate because he said, like David or was it Solomon, one of the two in the Bible, he had committed a great sin and God said, you shall not build the temple. Aberdeen did not build his temple. So that these things pushed along without any real consideration what was at stake or whether it was at stake, or whether even after this first engagement they couldn't go back to the arrangement which had been made before, which did not involve anything about the breakup of Turkey, or indeed any Russian influence in Turkey, other than that the Turks should express reasonable sympathy with the members of the Greek Orthodox Church. Instead, there the British and French were. They had said they were going to protect Turkey. They had sent their fleets to the Near East, and yet the Turkish fleet had been destroyed. The British and French fleets therefore went through into the Black Sea and issued an ultimatum ordering the Russian fleet to withdraw to harbour and not to come out again without British and French permission. This technically was the cause of the Crimean War as we understand it, that's to say, in which the great powers were involved. An ultimatum delivered actually in the Black Sea to order what the Russian fleet should do. The Russian fleet, although in fact it withdrew to Sevastopol, did not respond to the order as such. And in May 1854, the Crimean War was declared. It didn't begin because although the British and French had got their fleets in the Black Sea, how could they get at Russia? They were maritime powers. Russia was a a land power. By August, considerable British and French armies had accumulated at Constantinople, which needed no defense. And then again, it's a problem which often arises in war. The problem arose, where shall we go? What can we do with these armies that we've brought here? They couldn't march over land all the way from Constantinople to, well, I don't know, to Moscow. It would have taken them months, if not years, and they were totally without the transport to do it. So they said, let's take Sevastopol. This was the main Russian naval port. At the time, it was ill-defended. There were very few Russian troops there. And one reason why they picked on it, they said, it'll be easy. We'll take it in a week. Then we shall have a considerable military satisfaction, and public opinion will be satisfied. The British and French landed successfully. They moved on Sevastopol, and they didn't move fast enough. In fact, they were so pleased at landing, they thought it wasn't worthwhile to do anything else. Instead of it taking a week, it took 18 months for the British and French to capture Sevastopol. That was the Crimean War. What happened about the keys to the holy places, I've no idea. Whether the Latins got them, or the Greeks got them, or they shared them. Whether the Crimean War helped to preserve Turkey, I've no idea, although Turkey still exists. But in one sense, the Crimean War was of great importance. It set out what some who had advocated it wanted to do. It eliminated Russia as a great power in Europe for many years to come. You could argue that until the outbreak of the First World War, indeed I would argue that until 1941, nearly 100 years, Russia did not count in Europe to anything like the sense that she'd counted before the Crimean War. And this enabled other wars, I was going to say other wars, to take part. It enabled the liberal movements which had sought for national independence and freedom to go forward without actual Russian intervention. You must remember, of course, that people never adapt quickly enough. Even in the 1860s, long after the Crimean War, people were still regarding Russia with apprehension. The appreciation that the Russians had not only not the strength to intervene in Europe, but they'd lost patience. They didn't want to intervene. They felt, well, if Europe, all that Europe can offer us is the Crimean War. Remember, for the Russians, it was an invasion of Russia. Indeed, the leading English history of the Crimean War is called the invasion of the Crimea. Russia's been invaded 5 times by Europe, has never once invaded Europe. And the Crimean War, I suppose, of the 5, was the most successful in its limited way. So that the whole balance, not so much military, but political, was changed. The conservative, the reactionary powers which stood in the way of German nationalism and Italian nationalism were now very much on the defensive. And I think the principal consequence of the Crimean War is that the question of the unification of Italy could be raised up. It produced the second war of the decade, of the 1850s, the war with the very humdrum title of the Austro-French War of 1859. But with, whether it's a dramatic title or not, with very significant results for both Italy and for the history of Europe. In 1848, the great year of revolutions, the Italians had tried to liberate themselves. There were revolutions in every Italian state, because you must remember at that time Italy was divided into a great number of states, and the whole of northern Italy was inside the Austrian Empire. Both Lombardy, that's Milan, and Venetia were ruled directly from Vienna. It was occupied by an Austrian army which was composed mainly of Czechs, Hungarians, to a certain extent of Germans, and the Italians was under a completely alien rule in northern Italy. There had been national agitation, but no power. In 1848, as I say, there were risings everywhere. The Austrians were driven out of Lombardy and out of Venice. The little kingdom of Piedmont, sometimes called Sardinia, sent its army to the assistance of the liberal nationalists and was defeated. Austria reconquered Lombardy and Venice, and Austrian rule was restored. It was restored, I think, somewhat more harshly than before, because now there was complete estrangement between the Austrian rulers and the Italian ruled. There were new conspiracies, there were bomb plots, Austrian soldiers were shot at and killed. This is the kind of thing which happens with alien rule. But the Kingdom of Piedmont on its own was not strong enough to create Italy or to liberate northern Italy. In 1852, Piedmont acquired one of the great statesmen of the 19th century, Camillo Cavour, who decided that the right way to unite Italy was not by national passion, emotion, idealism, but by hard-headed diplomacy. He set out to win Napoleon III for the Italian cause. Napoleon III, on his side, believed that a united or a liberated Italy would be a grateful client state, that France would be able to dominate the Mediterranean. He also, again, wished to continue to repeat the achievement of his great uncle, who had set up a kingdom of Italy as a sort. Moreover, Napoleon III, as an absolute ruler, had to establish a reputation. Although he was by no means a distinguished soldier or general, he wanted to show that he was. He could have a war. And the paths, therefore, of Napoleon III and Cavour met. They met technically in secret at a place called Plombières in France, which is a spa, still a spa, very, very good spa water, I can recommend it. And while they were drinking the spa water, they made a deal. They would join, France would join Piedmont and get the Austrians out of northern Italy. In return, France would be allowed to acquire what were called the national frontiers of Savoy and Nice, which at that time were in the Kingdom of Piedmont. The main thing is they would get their war. But this is a fascinating problem. It's the first time it had come up, really. Came up a bit during the French Revolution, but broadly that French Revolutionary War was too much of a mess. All wars are expected to have a sort of technical, legal cause. You have to have grievances. You have to have claims to territory. But Piedmont had no claims to Austrian territory. By every treaty right in the world, Austria was the rightful ruler of northern Italy, of Lombardy and Venice. And international law, whatever tribunal in the world you'd have gone to, in the name of international law, and said the Austrians should go, the tribunal would have said, no, Austria is totally justified. There is no conceivable maxim of international law by which Austria should be compelled to withdraw from northern Italy, or for that matter, that you would be allowed to go to war with her. Cavour, he was a very clever man. He said he would provide some respectable cause of war, that he would discover some frontier grievance. And Napoleon III and Cavour racked their brains over this. Various family arrangements. One prince could be made to marry some princess, then they could complain that Austria was interfering or making claims against them. But the fact is that the grievance didn't turn up. On the other side, the Austrians, that is to say the Austrian government, grew increasingly irritated, exasperated by the more or less open preparations that were being made. Here was Piedmont preaching nationalism, subsidizing national propaganda, Italian national propaganda, in northern Italy, providing a refuge for Italian nationalists who'd had to escape from northern Italy, even although Piedmont was a monarchy, even providing a refuge for Italian republicans. There was a free press in Piedmont, the only one in Italy, the only one which talked in liberal terms. There was even a parliament with two chambers. meeting in Turin and claiming to speak in the name of Italy. This was very exasperating for a great imperial government, a prestige of hundreds of years, a government which was now being challenged by a most miserable little jumped-up state, or so it appeared, and with the implication that not only was Austrian government inadequate, tyrannical, which it wasn't by any means, it was easygoing and negligent on the whole, but certainly it wasn't Italian in character, but that where the Austrians had thought all along, because they had legitimate right behind them, that they were the moral party, it was now being suggested that for an empire to contain, to rule over people of a different nationality was actually immoral. Now, of course, this was particularly dynamite for the Austrian Empire because all its nationalities, all its territories, really were non-national. The emperor didn't belong to any nationality. His statesmen didn't belong to any nationality, though most of them spoke German. They were above nationality. And once you raised the cry of national rights and national freedom, the Austrian Empire might well break up, as happened indeed in 1918, for exactly this reason. The Austrians therefore felt that they must not only stand out against these national claims, they must get their blow in first. This is a fascinating paradoxical thing. Austria couldn't conceivably gain by war. Austria couldn't annex Piedmontese territory. That would give her more discontented Italians. She wasn't likely to be able to annex French territory. The Austrian line surely would have been to remain firmly at peace and to give no possible excuse, justification, or opening for war. Instead, the Austrians began to speak in increasingly bellicose terms. And then, rather like before the Crimean War, the other powers tried to prevent a war. They were afraid it would blaze up too much. The British government offered to mediate. The British ambassador in Paris went to Vienna, discussed the estrangement between Vienna and Paris. The Austrians said, well, they had nothing to be aggrieved about except they'd like to be left alone. The British ambassador took the message back. Then Russia thought they'd like to play some part, though a very remote one, and proposed a European Congress. European Congress was summoned, though it never met, and the Austrians mistakenly believed that what's sometimes called European opinion was moving onto their side. Surely they thought if they got their blow in first, they would knock out Sardinia, Piedmont, and would solve their problems. It was just at this moment that Napoleon deserted Cavour and said, we can't risk a war, you must disarm. While he was saying this in secret, the Austrians said it in public. They sent an ultimatum demanding that Piedmont should disarm without promising that Austria would as well. Cavour refused. The Austrians invaded Piedmont and were driven back. This was the beginning of the Austro-French War because France came to the aid of Sardinia. How ironical that the Austrians, if the Austrians had waited another few days, Napoleon III would have compelled Piedmont to disarm and the Austrians would have achieved their blow. I don't say they'd have achieved it forever. Nothing happens forever. But as it was, they lost northern Italy. At any rate, they lost Lombardy. Now, this is not quite the end of the story about the Italian wars of this time. 1859 was one war. In 1860, there was quite another war, a war which doesn't come in the books so much, at any rate, as a war. It was, in fact, the only, hope I'm right about this, the only guerrilla war in history which succeeded. This was an unofficial war. Garibaldi wanted to go somewhere to liberate some part of Italy. What he really desperately wanted to do was to liberate Rome, which at that time was ruled by the Pope. He had defended Rome in 1849, at the time when it was a republic. He wanted to repeat his success. Cavour was desperately anxious that Garibaldi should go somewhere else, anywhere, rather than go to Rome, which would cause an international crisis. And just at this time, fortunately, there was a peasant revolt in Sicily. They were always having peasant revolts in Sicily because the peasants were on very bad, under very bad conditions. And he persuaded Garibaldi to go off with a scratch force, 1,000 men, that's all. Incidentally, most of the middle class. When they were on their way, Garibaldi said to an Englishman there, "There's one curious thing about this expedition. I am the only working man on it." And I'm not sure he was a working man either. But to everyone's astonishment, this irregular force of 1,000 men managed to land in Sicily, managed to terrorize the army of the King of Naples, which held Sicily. This army, 70,000 men, were driven out by 1,000. They withdrew onto the mainland. And now Garibaldi decided to go ahead again. At any rate, he could get into Rome, he thought, from behind by marching on Naples. So he swept with the same, I was going to say ease, the same triumph. He swept right through Naples. And now there was the fear that he really would go on Rome. The only way to stop him was for the regular Piedmontese army to come down as an ally, as an antagonist. Who could say? It advanced down through Italy and encountered Garibaldi just when he was preparing to march on Rome. And at this moment he made his great sacrifice. Garibaldi was a Republican, but he was also an enthusiast for Italian unification. He had fought for this ticket. Indeed, in some ways, you could say he'd rather let down the peasants whom he had inspired and led and who had taken part in the liberation, first of Sicily and of Naples. He had not bothered about their land claims, although he was a man of the people and felt deeply for them. Yet, at the same time, the thing which was absolutely dominant in his mind was unification. He immensely distrusted and disliked Cavour, but he had a curious sentimental attachment to Victor Emmanuel III, the King of Italy, the King of Sardinia, who was very much a man of Italian character. And at this dramatic moment, in those days, you know, generals actually went around on horseback and met each other on horseback. Garibaldi, at the head of his revolutionary army, rode north from Naples. Victor Emmanuel III coming down from the north, and they encountered. And Garibaldi rode up to the king and said, "Hail to the King of Italy." And at this, Italy was born. On the way back into Naples, the king said, "How are you, caro Garibaldi?" "Excellent, Majesty." "And you?" "Very well." Victor Emmanuel asked Garibaldi what he'd like. "I'll make you a duke, give you a great estate." Garibaldi said, "All I want is a bag of seed corn for my farm at Caprera." And with that, he went back to his little farm. Such are the things which make Garibaldi the most wholly admirable man in modern history.